The sentence that changed everything sounded normal at first. "Please welcome the future of Bennett Freight." People clapped before the name even came out. I swear they were already halfway through their applause when my father finally said it. Madison Bennett. For a second, I honestly thought I heard him wrong. The ballroom smelled faintly like champagne and roasted salmon. Someone near the stage laughed too loudly. That weird kind of laugh people use at corporate parties when they're trying to sound important. Then, my sister walked up the steps. Perfect dress. Perfect smile. Like the whole thing had always belonged to her. My name is Charlotte Bennett. I am 34 years old, and that night was supposed to be the moment my family finally admitted what I had spent more than a decade building. 25 years of the company, 900 employees, 6 distribution hubs across the country, and somewhere in all of that, I had kind of become the person who actually knew how the machine worked. However, none of that mattered in that moment, because my father was standing under the stage lights, smiling like he had just handed the future of the company to exactly the right person. Madison waved at the room. People stood, clapping harder now. Investors, board members, reporters, everyone pretending this made sense. I didn't move. I kept my hands in my pockets and watched my sister accept a future she had never really built. Across the room, my grandmother Margaret lowered her glass. Slowly. Then she looked at me. Not confused, just very, very quiet. And that was the exact moment I realized the night wasn't over yet. People kept clapping while Madison stood on that stage. I didn't join them. Honestly, when you've spent enough years inside a company, applause like that starts sounding hollow, like people clapping because they're supposed to. Daniel Reeves leaned closer beside me, our chief financial officer. He's been with Bennett Freight long enough to remember when we had 1 warehouse and 2 trucks. "You seeing this?" he muttered. "Yeah," I said, hard not to. Madison lifted the microphone again. "Our expansion strategy will focus on strengthening the Western Corridor." Daniel made a quiet sound in his throat. "That line," he said. "That yours?" I didn't take my eyes off the stage. Yeah, the whole speech sounded familiar because I'd written most of it 3 months earlier. 12 pages. Long nights in the operations office with the vending machine buzzing behind me and the cleaning crew mopping the hall. Madison kept reading. Freight routes, fleet efficiency, new distribution hubs. Words she'd practiced, not lived. I didn't grow up in the polished side of Bennett Freight. My father made sure of that. My first job was at the Phoenix warehouse, night shift, scanning pallets while forklifts screamed past and drivers argued about delivery windows. That's where I learned the company. How 1 late truck can break 5 schedules. How a missing form can stall an entire route. Years later, I negotiated the Long Beach port contract and rebuilt our routing system. Margins climbed 21% in 3 years. Daniel knew it. Operations knew it. But my father rarely said my name when the numbers improved. On stage. Madison turned another page of the speech. Daniel exhaled slowly beside me. "Charlotte," he said under his breath, "this isn't going to end clean." My grandmother didn't clap either. Margaret Hawthorne sat near the front table, one hand around her wine glass. She'd been watching Madison for a while before she finally looked over at me. Not angry, not shocked, just measuring something. I walked closer. Daniel stayed behind. Margaret spoke without turning her head. "So," she said quietly, "that's how your father plans to do this." "Looks like it." She took a small sip of wine. Then she set the glass down. "You wrote that strategy she's presenting." It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I said. Margaret nodded once, like she'd just confirmed something she already knew. "You should understand something about my grandmother. 25 years ago, Bennett Freight was nothing but a dying warehouse outside San Antonio. Banks wouldn't touch it. Margaret wrote a check for $2,800,000 and told my father, 'Don't waste it. That money built the company.' And because of that investment, she owns 18% of it. She watched Madison on stage for another few seconds. Madison was talking about fleet expansion now, saying the words like they were her own. Margaret leaned slightly toward me. "I bought a car 3 weeks ago," she said. "A car Porsche 911 Turbo S." I blinked. "For the future leader of this company." She paused, then finally looked straight at me. "Strange thing," Margaret said softly. "I thought I knew who that was. The strange part is, I wasn't completely surprised. Not everything. Just enough to make the night feel wrong before it even started." That afternoon, I was walking down the second-floor hallway when I passed one of the smaller conference rooms. The door was half open. Inside, Madison was standing near the table with a printed speech in her hands. Lauren sat across from her. Lauren Bennett, my stepmother. Madison was practicing. "Our logistics expansion strategy focuses on strengthening the Western Corridor." Lauren raised a hand. "Slow down. Investors need to understand you." Madison sighed. "It's boring." "It's leadership language," Lauren said. "Just deliver it clearly." Madison kept reading. "Operational efficiency improved margins by 21% over the last 3 years. That was the moment something inside me went still. Those numbers weren't public yet. They came from the internal strategy report I presented to the executive team 3 months earlier." Madison flipped to the next page. "God, this speech is long." Lauren folded her arms. "You don't need to understand every line. Just say it confidently." Madison shrugged. "Dad said the board already supports the announcement anyway." I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, listening, long enough to understand what was happening. Then I kept walking. I could have stepped into that room. I could have confronted them right there. But I didn't. Instead, I went home, changed for the gala, and showed up that night knowing exactly what I was about to watch. Madison kept talking. The microphone hummed softly every time she shifted it closer to her mouth. Her voice was steady, confident enough that most people in the room didn't question it. "Our expansion strategy will focus on strengthening the Western Freight Corridor," she said. A few investors nodded. Someone at the second table murmured approval. Beside me, Daniel watched the stage with his arms folded. "She's reading your plan," he said quietly. "Yeah, and nobody's noticing." "Not yet." Madison turned another page of the speech. She talked about port partnerships, route efficiency, and long-term contracts. The kind of language executives like to hear. Clean, professional, safe. The room listened like it all made perfect sense. What bothered me wasn't that she was reading my work. It was how easily people believed it belonged to her. At the investor table, one man raised his glass toward my father. William Bennett smiled back proudly, like a king watching his heir claim the throne. That part stung more than anything. Daniel leaned a little closer. "You going to say something? No." He turned his head toward me. "No, not here." On stage, Madison finished another section and the applause came again, louder this time. Lauren stood near the stage with a satisfied smile, like the evening had unfolded exactly the way she planned. Then my father stepped forward and placed a hand on Madison's shoulder. "Tonight," he said proudly, "we celebrate the future of Bennett Freight." The room quieted to listen. This company started with one warehouse 25 years ago. Today, we operate 6 national hubs and employ more than 900 people. More applause followed. Then he lifted his glass. "And with Madison leading us forward, I'm confident the next 25 years will be even stronger." Madison smiled at the crowd. Across the ballroom, Margaret Hawthorne slowly rose from her chair. Daniel noticed first. "Oh," he murmured. "Well, that's interesting." Margaret didn't rush. That's the thing about my grandmother. When something matters, she slows down instead of speeding up. Madison had just finished another paragraph when a hand lifted from the investor table. Harold Simmons, board member, former logistics executive, the kind of man who spent 40 years turning freight numbers into profit. Madison, he said evenly. Could you walk us through the EBITDA projection for the Phoenix expansion? Madison paused, just a second too long. Well, she began carefully. Our projections show strong margin growth across the Western network. Harold gave a small nod. Yes, but I asked about Phoenix. Madison glanced down at the papers in her hand. The speech didn't help her. It was written for applause, not questions. Our operational efficiency plan will improve margins across multiple hubs, she said. Harold folded his hands. That's the overview. I'm asking for the numbers. The room grew noticeably quieter. Madison gave a small laugh that sounded thinner than she probably intended. The operations team handled some of those calculations. Harold leaned back slightly. So you don't have the figures. Before Madison could respond, my father stepped forward. Harold, he said with a polite smile, tonight is a celebration. We can review projections at the next board meeting. Another voice spoke from the investor tables. I'd like to hear the answer too. Karen Wu said calmly. Our fund invested based on that expansion plan. Madison looked down again. I'd need to confirm the exact numbers, she admitted. The silence that followed spread across the ballroom. Behind me, Daniel exhaled slowly. And at the front table, Margaret Hawthorne finally rose to her feet. Margaret Hawthorne didn't hurry. She rose from her chair and walked toward the stage the same way she walks into a boardroom, calm, steady, certain. When Margaret moves slowly, it usually means something important is about to happen. Madison stepped back from the microphone as she approached. Grandma Madison said with an uneasy smile, We're kind of in the middle of Margaret didn't respond to her. Daniel, she said, her voice clear across the room. Bring the file. Behind me, Daniel straightened. You sure? He asked quietly. Margaret gave a single nod. Now. Daniel walked past me carrying a thin laptop. One by one, the conversations around the room faded as people noticed what was happening. My father stepped forward quickly. Mother, tonight is a celebration. This isn't the time. Margaret turned toward him. William, she said evenly. Sit down. The words weren't loud, but they stopped the room. My father didn't sit, but he didn't argue either. Daniel connected the laptop to the projector beside the stage. Madison's presentation disappeared from the screen behind her. New documents appeared. Internal reports, strategy drafts, operations projections. Madison frowned at the screen. What is this? Margaret answered calmly. These are the reports that built the company's recent expansion. Daniel opened the first file. At the top of the page were two simple words. Author Charlotte Bennett. Another document appeared. Charlotte Bennett. Then another. Murmurs began spreading across the investor tables. Harold Simmons leaned forward in his chair. Karen Wu stopped speaking and focused on the screen. Madison turned toward my father. Dad Margaret finally faced the room. You are about to place the future of this company in the hands of someone presenting work she did not create. She lifted her hand and pointed toward the back of the ballroom. Toward me. The person responsible for this strategy, Margaret said calmly, is standing right there. Every head in the room turned toward me. For a moment, no one moved. Even the quiet hum of the air vents above the ceiling suddenly sounded louder. Madison stared at me like the ground had shifted under her feet. Charlotte, she said. My father didn't speak. Daniel stood beside the projector, waiting. Margaret simply watched me, calm as ever. I started walking, slowly. No rush. People stepped aside as I crossed the ballroom. The path opened without anyone saying a word. I stepped onto the stage. Madison moved back instinctively. I didn't look at her. Instead, I faced the board first. Then the investors. Finally, my father. If the board has questions about the strategy presented tonight, I said evenly, I'm happy to answer them. The room stayed quiet. I started at the Phoenix warehouse 12 years ago. I continued. Night shift. Scanning freight and learning how the routes actually worked. Daniel brought another document onto the screen behind me. Port contracts, routing plans, financial projections. I worked dispatch, fleet routing, contract negotiations. Over time, I helped redesign the network that raised our margins 21%. A few board members exchanged glances. My job was never inheritance. I said, my job was solving problems. Madison looked down at the stage floor. I took one steady breath. I didn't build this strategy for applause. Then I looked directly at the board. I built it because this company deserves leadership that understands how it actually works. The room didn't explode the way people imagine. No shouting, no chaos. Just a heavy silence. Harold Simmons stood slowly and adjusted his jacket. I believe the board should step aside for a brief discussion, he said calmly. Karen Wu nodded from the investor table. I agree. My father stepped toward the microphone. This really isn't necessary. The succession plan has already been discussed with Margaret. Cut him off without raising her voice. William, you announced it. The board hasn't voted on it tonight. The words settled over the room like a weight. Harold gestured toward the hallway beside the ballroom. Board members, please. Several directors stood and followed him out. The doors closed behind them. Quiet conversations filled the room. Glasses clinked softly. Someone shifted a chair. Madison leaned toward my father. This is ridiculous, she whispered. William didn't respond. He was watching me. About 10 minutes later, the doors opened and the board returned. Harold stepped forward again. The board has agreed to suspend the succession announcement made earlier this evening. A few people in the room quietly exhaled. He continued, effective immediately. Charlotte Bennett will serve as Chief Operating Officer of Bennett Freight while the board conducts a formal leadership review. Daniel smiled slightly beside the projector. Across the stage, Margaret lifted her wine glass again. And in that quiet moment, the balance inside the company shifted. The ballroom emptied slowly after the announcement. No dramatic speeches, no raised voices, just quiet conversations and the low music still playing in the background, like the band hadn't realized the night had changed. Madison walked past me first. She kept her eyes on the floor. Lauren followed a step behind her. My father stopped a few feet away from me. For a moment, he just studied my face. You could have handled that privately, he said. I looked back at him. Didn't feel private when it was announced in front of 900 people. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and walked toward the exit. A minute later, my grandmother appeared beside me, holding a small set of keys. She placed them in my hand. For the future leader of this company, Margaret said. I glanced down at the key. Porsche 911 Turbo S. She added calmly. I hesitated. You're still sure about that? Margaret smiled slightly. I don't buy cars for the wrong person. Later that night, I sat in the parking garage with the engine idling softly under my hands. Truth is, it was never really about the car. Sometimes people take your work, your credit, even your place in the room. But work leaves a trail. Numbers, decisions, results. Sooner or later, the truth catches up. That night, driving out of the garage, I realized something simple. I hadn't won anything. I had just finally been seen.